Jared Farmer is a professor of history at Stony Brook University in New York. He studies historical aspects of landscape, environment, technology, science, religion, and culture, and how they overlap with a strong regional expertise in the American West. His 2008 book, On Zion's Mount, Mormons, Indians, and the American Landscape, received numerous awards, including a Francis Parkman Prize for the best written nonfiction book on an American theme. A later work, Trees in Paradise, love that title, A California History, was named best book on the history of native and or settler peoples in frontier or borderland zones. Jared's Academy project brings together the history of trees and the science of longevity to examine the ethics of long-term thinking about our current geological age, the Anthropocene. His book, The Latest, Oldest Tree, Survival Stories for a Time of Extinction, is under contract with Basic Books. This evening, Jared's lecture will look at the global history of conservation from the perspective of monumental trees, following Alexander von Humboldt from South America and returning to Berlin before the First World War. His talk, as always, will be followed by a question and answer period, and then more conversation in our living room next door. So without any further ado, let me turn over to Jared. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Christine, for that kind introduction. Here at the Academy, as you said, I am privileged to hold a fellowship named in honor of the late Anna Maria Kellen. Everyone who passes through this house is the recipient of her generosity. I honor Frau Kellen's memory and offer gratitude to the extended Kellen-Arnhold family. I also want to thank the staff at the Academy, particularly John Eltringham, for arranging this event. Tonight, I'm going to talk in transatlantic terms about old trees and so-called protected areas. That's a legalistic term that emerged in the post-World War II global Anglophone era. If the World Bank and the IMF form one axis of the post-war international order, the World Wildlife Fund and the International Union for Conservation of Nature form another. The IUCN came into being in 1948. The organization is known for its red lists of threatened species. It also sets guidelines and collects data about habitat protection. Since 1978, IUCN has promulgated standard categories of protected areas. Its current schema dates to 1994, following the Earth Summit in Rio 2 years earlier. According to the Convention on Biological Diversity, a treaty that has now been signed by 168 nations, though still unratified by the US Senate, signatories have until 2020, next year, to meet various targets. According to Target 11, at least 17% of terrestrial and inland water, especially areas of particular importance for biodiversity and ecosystem services, are conserved through systems of protected areas. From 2004 to 2014, signatories designated 43,000 new protected areas. Currently, the global map shows some 200,000 protected areas covering 15% of the planet's terrestrial surface. So that's the good news. The bad news: conservation biologists, most notably E.O. Wilson, believe that 17% is not nearly enough to prevent catastrophic losses in biodiversity, especially considering the compounding effects of climate change. Wilson advocates half-Earth conservation. Getting even halfway to half, 25%, will be hard. That's because signatories did the easy stuff first. They protected areas of low human population and low economic value. In other words, they prioritize surface area, the most easily quantifiable target. States generally disregarded the treaty's charge to prioritize areas of particular importance for biodiversity. Even worse, many protected areas are protected on paper only. Last year, Science magazine published a major study based on analyses of satellite imagery on the footprint of human activity within reserves. The authors concluded that 6 million square kilometers, or 33% of protected land, is under intense human pressure. Worse still, many areas have been subject to what's called PADD, or PAD, Protected Area Downgrading, Downsizing, and Degazettement. There's a website devoted to tracking this. At this point, you may be wondering, what are the official categories of protected areas? Well, here's the latest iteration of the IUCN schema. Each of the 6 categories suggests a relative size, which I've indicated on the right. In addition to size, large to small, you could place each kind of protected area on other continuums, like non-utilized to utilized, or unpopulated to permanently inhabited, or state-managed to locally stewarded. A social scientist might look at this chart and think of scales of collective action. Transborder and global environmental problems are impossible to address without states. Similarly, extensive national parks that protect megafauna from poachers typically require intensive state management, sometimes with assistance from international NGOs. At the other end of the scale, many small-scale protected areas listed by states receive no state funding. Their protection is entirely the work of local volunteers. I'm a historian, not a social scientist, and my purpose tonight is to provide a brief genealogy of the idea protected area. By this, I mean a modern political system of nature protection. Specifically, I mean the bureaucratic classification by polities, mainly states, of parcels of territory as permanent nature reserves managed by officially recognized custodians for and against certain uses. There are, of course, ancient precursors, the 2 most important being what we call in English sacred groves and royal forests. Sacred groves have appeared in various cultural and temporal contexts, and they persist today in parts of Africa and South Asia. Defined broadly, a sacred grove is a delimited and consecrated wooded area where resource use is restricted and ritualized and managed by a local spiritual authority. As for royal forests, they used to be endemic to Europe, whereas commoners had shared access to woodlands for mixed uses. Royals had separate forests for their exclusive uses, mainly hunting. In the modern period, in fits and starts, European states instituted a new kind of zoning. Instead of the dyad of woodlands and royal forests, a triad: 1, plantation forests owned by private business interests; 2, silvicultural forests owned and managed by state offices of forestry; and 3, forest reserves managed by nations, lender, or cities. To give you a local example, the Grunewald, now a city reserve, used to be a royal forest. It became public only after rabble-rousers from Berlin repeatedly crashed the Kaiser's hunting party. As the title of my talk suggests, my topic tonight is the smallest of the IUCN's 6 categories, the natural monument, which is also the oldest of these protected areas. But for comparison's sake, I will introduce the natural monument through a category more familiar to Americans, the national park. So there's a story Americans love to tell, a myth, a creation story that Europeans have often repeated uncritically. Americans claim that they invented the national park. The best idea we ever had, they say. No one ever thought of it before. Supposedly, the idea sprang into the heads of U.S. surveyors in the fall of 1870 around a campfire in Yellowstone near the headwaters of the Missouri. This wonderland of bison and elk, geysers and waterfalls, prismatic springs, and candy-colored canyons should be reserved, the surveyors said. They returned to D.C., talked to congressional leaders and Congress in 1872, set aside a public park or pleasuring ground for the benefit and enjoyment of the people. Later, Europeans realized the egalitarian wisdom of this American ideal, wild nature for the people, and they created their own national park. Smaller, of course, because everything in Europe is smaller. The truth is more complicated and more international. Yellowstone was not, in fact, the first U.S. reserve called a national park. That terminology was for decades a plastic idea without formal definition. The first nation to create a formal national park system was Sweden in 1909, 7 years before Congress created the U.S. National Park Service. Sweden adapted the Yellowstone model for its northern lands, extensive reserves with spectacular wildlife managed intensively for the enjoyment of the people. Who were the people? Sweden considered the Sami part of Swedish nature rather than members of the Swedish public for whom the northern parks were created. In the 19th century US, for comparison, the state not only legally excluded tribal members from citizenship, it spatially excluded natives from Yellowstone National Park. Various indigenous groups, Arapahoes, Bannocks, Blackfeet, Crows, Flatheads, Nez Perce, Northern Cheyenne, and Sheep-eater Shoshones, who had seasonally used Yellowstone, became trespassers and poachers. The US Army, the original caretakers of Yellowstone, herded Indians onto Indian reservations while protecting white citizen tourists on the wildlife reservation. When British, German, and Belgian imperialists created large-scale wildlife parks in Africa, they vacillated between thinking of Africans as natural or intrusive. There is an alternative origin story for the national park idea, a continental European innovation that also predates the US National Park Service. It begins with the Swiss National Park. You probably don't know about this. That's partly because this protected area was established on August 1st, Swiss National Day, in 1914, which just so happened to be the day World War I began. Bad timing. The Swiss model, emulated in Bavaria and in interwar Poland, was very different than the Yellowstone model. Scientists, not railroads, promoted this park. In selecting an alpine site, Swiss experts avoided the most spectacular, the most touristy part of the Alps. They did not prioritize scenery or public enjoyment. Instead, they prioritized ecological integrity. The Swiss National Park was not for the people, per se. It was a natural laboratory, a watershed where scientists monitored ecological processes according to non-interventionist principles. Białowieża, Poland's first national park, the largest relic old-growth forest in Europe, followed the Swiss model. In the 1920s, the U.S. Forest Service developed a U.S. equivalent, so-called roadless areas. American conservationists and ecologists took the European model of the strict nature reserve and they wrapped it in the settler colonial fantasy of wilderness and the American preoccupation with automobility. In 1964, in the Wilderness Act, Congress codified roadlessness as the defining characteristic of strict nature reserves in the U.S. Here's a recent map of the National Wilderness System. Okay, so that briefly covers the origins of the IUCN's first category of protected areas. But what about the natural monument? Even though on the list it comes third, chronologically it comes first. And here we have another creation story, this one told by Germans and repeated uncritically by other Europeans, though largely ignored by Americans. It starts with Alexander von Humboldt, of course, the man who invented everything, ecology, nature, the cosmos. Just kidding. But the legend and legacy of Humboldt is truly powerful, as we're seeing this year on his 250th birthday. Humboldt is a useful consensus figure for 21st century Germans, more so than Goethe, given today's reading habits. You don't have to read Humboldt to get the Humboldtian essence. His aristocratic lifestyle is quite relatable to many middle-class people today because Humboldt's passion was discovering beauty and insight through travel. If Humboldt were around today, he'd be Instagramming his tropical adventures, giving TED Talks, and starring in IMAX films directed by Werner Herzog. I can see why his name has been attached to the new Stadtschloss. His legacy is untainted by the Third Reich and the Deutsches Kaiserreich, and while his life is inseparable from imperialism, he's linked to Spanish colonialism in the Americas rather than Prussian colonialism in Poland. And his friendship with Simón Bolívar and his views on slavery make him seem generally on the right side of history, despite heroic images like this, which are, frankly, hard to look at today given the non-Europeans used as foils, as natural scenery in the background. But I'm getting away from the origin story. Supposedly, Humboldt went to Venezuela, and there he discovered a perfectly round, umbrellaed canopy of an enormous old tree worshipped by local Indians. To describe this site, Humboldt invented a new term in French, le monument de la nature, translated as Naturdenkmäler. Humboldt's poetic description opened the eyes of Europeans that organic landmarks could be classified alongside built monuments. A century later, a great Prussian conservationist, Hugo Convents, gave Naturdenkmal, translated into English as natural monument, a bureaucratic meaning and secured state recognition of small-scale protected areas. And this form of Prussian statecraft spread throughout Germany and then the world. There are many problems with this just so story, and with the rest of my lecture, I will offer some correctives. The fuller history is still quite Germanic, but not exclusively so, and still quite Arbocentric, but again, not exclusively so. Today, the word monument primarily refers to human-built structures that are intentionally commemorative. The word used to have wider meanings. A monument could be anything from the past that offered a reminder to the present. It could be a tomb, a document, and so on. The phrase monument of nature predates Humboldt by a generation or two. It was part of the vocabulary of 18th century French savants who investigated what we now call geology. The great Comte de Buffon even proposed a schema of les monuments de la nature: subfossil bones in the soil, fossils and surface rocks, fossils and subsurface strata, and so on. Early geologists explicitly compared fossils to documents and coins, historical evidence that could be read and interpreted to assemble a chronological story, a geohistory. What Humboldt did was to popularize the transfer of this idea to botany. Whereas geologists wondered if they could use inanimate material to date the Earth, speculations that led to millions and ultimately billions of years, botanists wondered if a single living organism could take them beyond 6,000 years, beyond biblical chronologies. In overlapping ways, geologists and botanists wanted to burst the limits of time. Using Linnaean taxonomy, European botanists, many of them attached to a new kind of institution, the botanical garden, began to study comparative longevity in plant species. They assumed, incorrectly it turns out, that the oldest trees would be the biggest trees, and that the biggest trees would occur in the subtropical zone where climate was favorable to growth and where the history of human wood use was less intensive than in Europe and Asia. As initially estimated by European scientists, the oldest living thing in the world was either a baobab in Senegal or a dragon tree in Tenerife. So the latter, here's the tree, you can't guess, earned world fame. That's because its location, Tenerife, was a popular resort and prior to that, a key launching pad for transatlantic voyages. Long before the age of health tourism, the image of the Canary Island dragon tree became famous for medicinal and iconographic reasons. After the rediscovery of the Canaries in the 14th century, the islands became associated with various mythological locations such as the Fortunate Isles. In late medieval art, paintings, engravings, tapestries, the dragon tree became a symbol of the Garden of Eden. It appeared in works by Dürer and by Bosch. Meanwhile, red resin harvested from the species, one of several substances that was traded under the name dragon's blood, became a staple of early modern British and European apothecaries. Because of their location and their history, the Canaries could be imagined by Europeans as Mediterranean or tropical, African or American. When the Baron Friedrich Wilhelm Heinrich Alexander von Humboldt visited in 1799 carrying an all-access royal passport stamped by Charles IV of Spain, he expressed his state of ecstasy at finding myself at length on African soil, surrounded by palm trees and the growth of 1,000 years. I could almost weep at the prospect of leaving this place, he wrote, yet I am scarcely out of Europe. By the time of Humboldt's visit, it was standard practice for travelers to visit the garden of a noted family in the village of Orotava, where the largest known dragon tree grew. Humboldt stated confidently that this arborescent asparagus was one of the oldest inhabitants of our globe, and that its age could be scientifically estimated. He repeated the local belief that the organic landmark was already massive at the time of conquest, when it served as a boundary point for dividing Guanche land among the conquistadors. In more general terms, Humboldt expressed his belief that the earth sustained living trees dating back to Rome, Greece, Egypt. He conjectured that there might even be trees of such antiquity they witnessed the most recent physical revolution, by which he meant a catastrophic transition from one geologic epoch to another. In the atlas accompanying his best-selling account of his journey to America, Humboldt included as his final illustration a fanciful rendering of the dragon tree of Orotava. This was the first published view of the tree, and it caused a sensation. In 1819, half the crown fell off in a hurricane, but the mega-succulent lost no stature in the imagination. It enchanted young Darwin. He copied Humboldt's descriptions of Tenerife and read them aloud to friends and family. He wrote his sister from Cambridge, "In the morning I go and gaze at palm trees in the hothouse and come home and read Humboldt. My enthusiasm is so great I can't hardly sit on my chair. I will never be easy till I see the peak of Tenerife and the great dragon tree." To others, Darwin spoke of his canary ardor and his canary scheme. "Nothing will prevent us from seeing the great dragon tree," he told a friend. Alas, Darwin never set foot on Tenerife, though he came so tantalizingly close. As the Beagle approached land, Captain Fitzroy was met by Spanish functionaries who ordered that the British vessel stay in quarantine for 12 days as a precaution. Fitzroy sailed on. Gazing from the deck at his long wished-for object, Darwin contemplated his doom. "Oh, misery, misery," he wrote in his diary. For Darwin's idol, Alexander von Humboldt, the image of the dragon tree remained potent into old age. In his career summation, Cosmos, Humboldt reflected on the childhood inspirations that compelled him to become a globe-trotting naturalist. Chief among them was a colossal dragon tree in an old tower of the Botanischer Garten, Berlin. It and the greenhouse palms implanted in my breast the first germ of an irrepressible longing for distant travel. That tree is long gone, but today, in one of the Schauhäuser in Dahlem, there is this post-war specimen of Drachenbaum, or maybe you could call it Mammutspargel. By the time of Humboldt's death in 1859, many travel writers claim, falsely, that the polymath had calculated the tree's age at 4,000, 6,000, 10,000 years. When the reputed ancient collapsed in 1868, commentators castigated the Spanish for not having propped it up, even though the earliest photographs clearly show props. An Italian horticulturalist portrayed the demise of this historical monument as proof of the general carelessness of the Spanish people and the Spanish government have for whatever concerns botany and natural beauties. I've spent so much time on the dragon tree because, well, it's cool, and also because it served as the model of perception for a different tree in America that was the ideal for the Humboldtian idea of monuments of nature. Humboldt was actually quite loose in his use of the word monument, as seen in his famous personal narrative. He spoke of languages as the original monuments of nations and posited that philology could, in the absence of built monuments, allow scholars to infer human migrations in the past. Elsewhere, he referred to the edifices of Aztecs, Toltecs, Olmecs, and Zapotecs as monuments, though he called them barbarous or semi-barbarous monuments, meaning that they were valuable less as art than as historical evidence about the development of the human species. By contrast, he considered Greek ruins both monuments of art and history. Humboldt expressed disappointment that in South America, at least the parts he saw, the grandness of nature was unembellished by monuments of antiquity, like in Mexico. When Humboldt barometrically measured the summit of the coastal range above Caracas and determined that it was lower than the highest peaks in Iberia and Tenerife, his local hosts expressed their own disappointment. Humboldt responded with condescension. One cannot blame the national feeling, which suggests exaggerated ideas of the monuments of nature in a country in which the monuments of art are nothing, he wrote. Most European historians of protected areas single out just one different passage from Humboldt's narrative, also about Venezuela. In early 1800, Humboldt visited some local dignitaries at their haciendas near Maracay, about 100 kilometers west of Caracas. On the main road, Humboldt encountered, annoyingly he wrote, "We discovered," a tree that looked like a tumulus, an umbrella, a vegetable roof. Humboldt liked to measure everything, so he calculated the diameter and circumference of this amazingly wide, amazingly symmetrical saban, or rain tree, an arborescent member of the pea family. It had persisted unchanged since the conquistadors, Humboldt said. It was as old as the Orotava dragon tree, he said. How he knew these things, who knows, but when Humboldt said things, they became facts. Humboldt reported that local villagers, especially indigenous ones, held the rain tree in veneration. He asserted categorically that in countries destitute of monuments of art, people protect monuments of nature and punish violators. Humboldt claimed that a local farmer had been tried and punished for cutting a branch off the sacred tree. This might be true. I have no way of verifying Humboldt's report. In any case, his statement about tree veneration aligned with 19th century German scholarship on religion, the scholarship that more or less invented the modern category religion, which placed Baumkultus, tree worship, at the primitive animistic end of religious development. The idea that pagan Germanic tribes had an exceptional mystical relationship with the forest was largely a 19th century invention. In other words, German scholasticism, German proto-nationalism, and European romanticism worked together to cause a reconsideration of sacred trees. If a dragon tree in the Botanischer Garten Berlin compelled Humboldt to go to America to discover monuments of nature, the idea returned home, where Germans applied it to German nature. Ironically, rationalism, as much as romanticism, created the conditions for secular sacred trees protected by the state. As you probably know, 19th century Germans instituted so-called scientific forestry. State foresters classified trees by age cohorts so they could harvest mature specimens, typically fast-growing non-native conifers, at optimal times. This instrumental approach to crop rotation was facilitated by a new instrument, the Increment Borer. This elegant invention allowed extraction of a pencil-thin core sample without damage to the organism. Because a Swedish manufacturer captured the US market, Americans came to know this as the Swedish increment borer, but the device had in fact been perfected by Max Robert Pressler of Dresden. He called his coring tool der Zuwachsbohrer, literally growth drill. Even as they rationalized and segregated timber into age classes, foresters noted remarkable trees, merkwürdige Bäume, on their inventory maps as relics to be preserved in the midst of the new state forest. Over time, this practice of documenting remarkable trees crossed over from forestry departments to homeland protection clubs. By the late 1800s, German associations were publishing regional tree guides, Baumbücher. Honoring individual trees seemed to resolve a cultural contradiction, for Germans celebrated both their modern brand of rational forestry and their völkisch bond with old trees. In their acts of modern reverence, Germans started with oaks, the tree of Zeus, Jupiter, and Thor, the totem of Gaelic and Germanic pagans. Moderns created new categories of old oaks, tausendjährigen Eichen and vielhundertjährigen Eichen. In this way, modernity created antiquity, or if you like, the rational disenchantment of the forest brought forth a secular reenchantment of individual trees, elms, lindens, and especially oaks. It's telling that the titular instrument of the Zauberflöte was carved from the heartwood of a millennial oak. Likewise, it's telling that many German towns and villages marked the unification of the Deutsches Kaiserreich by ceremonially planting oak trees, like this one I pass regularly on Kleierlee in Zehlendorf. Strikingly, National Socialist planners saved one old oak in the section of the Grunewald they cleared for the Olympic Stadium. And most hauntingly, the SS, when clearing the forest that became Buchenwald, spared a big oak that had been previously registered by Thuringian foresters. In other words, by the 1930s, the impulse to protect arboreal monuments of nature had been internalized by Germans. It had also become legalized, and this is where the figure Hugo Convents comes in. This minor minister in the German Empire, based in Danzig and later Schöneberg, Berlin, became internationally famous among conservationists in the years before World War I. Convents headed the world's first state agency for protected areas, established in 1906. It was called the Prussian Office of Naturdenkmäler, or the care of natural monuments. Convents introduced and defined the modern legalistic meaning of Naturdenkmal and promulgated it as the best state practice to bureaucrats around the industrial world. As an aside, I'll point out that it's generally impossible for historians to definitively pinpoint the origin of anything. What was the original protected area and the original natural monument in the modern sense of those terms? Some German historians point to Baumannshöhle, a cave in Germany protected by ducal decree in 1668. And there are many more geological examples from the first half of the 19th century. As for botanical examples, no historian before me seems to have recognized that the great Saman tree of Venezuela was legally protected as a Venezuelan national monument in 1851, not because of its association with Humboldt, but with Bolivar. But the first systematic protection program occurred in 1860s Switzerland, where natural history societies led an effort to inventory and preserve glacial erratics, monuments of the Eiszeit, threatened by crushed rock mining. Preserving boulders meant purchasing them. But this was a private program, not a federal or cantonal one. Working through state channels, Hugo Convents combined the initial geological meaning of Le Monument de la Nature with the later botanical meaning associated with Humboldt. Convents was trained as a paleobotanist, and for him, remarkable tree was a scientific more than an aesthetic category. He was less interested in legendary oaks than rare and relic species, especially yews, Iben, that provided proxy data about climate and habitat in the deep past. He also thought, correctly, that microhabitats could have outsized ecological importance and deserve protection irrespective of beauty or recreational value. Convents had no state money for land acquisitions. His office of Naturdenkmäler was primarily a fact-gathering organization. It sent out thousands of questionnaires in service of a master registry of Prussia's glacial erratics, delightfully called Findlingen in German, I love that word, and also remarkable trees. Convents' staff collected and collated this information, then distributed it to museums and schools. In other words, the office did not actually protect. Convents believed that a centralized database of objects registered for care complemented a decentralized practice of caregiving. The real protection of natural monuments depended on local volunteers. And here's where Convents' science-based inventory project dovetailed with educational reform. Compared to many in the homeland protection movement, Convents was quite conservative. He did not critique capitalists and industrialists for endangering the Naturdenkmäler. Instead, he faulted educators for insufficiently instilling nature love through Heimatkunde. Naively, Convents believed that the Polish subjects of Germanization would develop more Heimish affinity for Prussia through nature education. A frequent speaker at international conferences, Convents spread the bureaucratic gospel of Naturdenkmäler. His idea quickly spread all over continental Europe, including Russia, and also Japan, where Meiji botanists replicated the Prussian model. Convents' success was due in part due to his strategy of framing nature protection as heritage preservation, a legalistic move that built on the example of France. From the Revolution onward, the French state had been deeply involved in the protection of monuments. Revolutionaries and later the French Commune defaced or destroyed many edifices, and in response, the Republic asserted its powers of classification and preservation over royal and ecclesiastical monuments, reimagined as patrimony of the people. Much like Germans registered ancient trees while modernizing the forest, the French created architectural protection zones while housemanizing the city. This ultimately resulted in the seminal 1887 French law on the conservation of monuments and objects of art of historical and artistic interest. In the United States, such developments were well known to groups like the American Scenic and Historic Preservation Society. Most importantly, Congress in 1909 passed the Antiquities Act, which gave the executive the right to set aside federal land for the protection of objects of historic or scientific interest. This bill was written by Edgar Hewitt, an archaeologist who had earned his doctorate in Geneva. The Antiquities Act was meant to expedite the protection of Puebloan ruins in the Southwest. This law clearly derived from European precedent, though U.S. historians have largely missed this fact. Indeed, the law most closely resembled the Hessian Code for the Protection of Monuments enacted in 1902, Unlike Prussia, Hesse subsumed natural monuments under architectural monuments. But the United States, in the person of President Theodore Roosevelt, quickly diverged from the European model. Roosevelt thought big, despite the phrase smallest compatible area of federal land in the Antiquities Act. He interpreted the law as congressionally delegated authority to create national parks, and many of his monuments, starting with the Grand Canyon, were anything but small. The Supreme Court later affirmed his maximal authority. For this and other reasons, the concept Naturdenkmal never really caught on in the United States. But it did, surprisingly, in Poland, starting in the Austro-Hungarian section of the partition, where Poles had more freedom to protect Polish nature. Back in 1834, in the national epic Pan Tadeusz, Mickiewicz had eulogized our monuments eaten by Muscovite axes. In the early 1900s, one prominent Polish conservationist found the concept Heimat so useful, he translated this untranslatable into his native tongue. Working out of universities in Krakow and Lviv, Polish botanists worked to inventory, register, and protect natural monuments in the Kingdom of Galicia. This was emblematic of the times. In the pre-World War I era, when intensive industrial pollution and extensive landscape destruction were for the first time becoming international issues, conservationists in many nations and empires tried to protect landscapes and habitats by harnessing national or subnational feelings. Old trees, with all their pre-existing cultural meanings, were useful for such activism. After World War I, and again after World War II, Poles preserved Prussian Naturdenkmäler, just with different signage. In general, protected areas, as first conceived, represented a compensation to, rather than a confrontation with, industrial capitalism. Even in Conventz's time, advocates of maximal Naturschutz criticized konventionellen nature protection. And I thought only Americans did bad puns, but there you go. Most famously, Hermann Luntz, a well-known Heimat writer, dismissed Naturdenkmalpflege as Pritzelkram. And out of historical context, this idiomatic insult is impossible to capture in English. Pritzelkram means something like cutesy botanizing or small potatoes, but it also has the connotations of rearranging the deck chairs in the Titanic or fiddling while Rome burns. Impatient with small measures, many conservationists, not just German ones, initially cheered when the National Socialists in 1935 enacted a comprehensive nature protection law, including the right of the state to seize Naturdenkmäler. After World War II, the German contribution to the first international movement for protected areas was largely forgotten or buried in memory. Similarly, the so-called Heimat movement, which was actually a spectrum of subnational movements, became tainted by association with National Socialism. In the context of German shame, Americans were happy to claim that they invented protected areas. In the post-war period, the supersized U.S. national monument, basically a Rooseveltian mini-national park, gradually took over the meaning of natural monument. Indeed, many European states have obviated the category natural monument in favor of protected areas that better match the IUCN's Category 3. For example, here in Germany, in 2010, the updated Federal Conservation Act added an awkward neologism, Nationales Naturmonument. Thousands of old Naturdenkmäler, redefined as protected areas less than 5 hectares in size, still exist and have nominal state protection. Online you can find spreadsheets of these boulders and trees. Legally speaking, they are relics of the Weimar Constitution, which said, "The monuments of art, history, and nature enjoy the protection and care of the state." The era when Germans combined historic preservation and nature protection seems bygone. In the post-war period, Denkmale, historic sites and buildings, and Gedenkstätte, memorials, especially Holocaust memorials, split into different categories and practices, leaving Naturdenkmäler somewhat homeless. So maybe the moral of my transatlantic story is this: the American champions of Yellowstone were right all along. Bigger is better. E.O. Wilson and the advocates of half-Earth protection would agree. The scale of home protection must match our capacity to destroy our planetary home. I agree, but I would add this. Small-scale care is complementary to, and indeed constitutive of, large-scale long-term protection, because protected areas of all sizes need local, multi-generational communities of protectors. Otherwise, their legal status as protected is meaningless. Here's a lesson for people like me. The American Academy, and Berlin in general, is full of cosmopolitan people who care about the Earth, who care about international relations and the Atlantic Alliance, and who feel at home in global cities. I'm one of them. But most people in the world, though connected through the World Wide Web, lead local lives and evaluate environmental problems in local terms. It's a problem, I think, when big city environmentalists avoid the language of homeland, the language of patriotism, and the scale of the local landmark. When they cede this rhetorical and territorial ground, adversaries fluent in the language of blood and soil readily claim the space. This is why the French critic Bruno Latour has begun speaking politically and theologically about the terrestrial. In the United States, cosmopolitan environmentalists are not going to convince Trump supporters to become climate activists by talking about IPCC scenarios, atmospheric parts per million, and global citizenship. I dare say what the world needs now, in addition to functioning democracies committed to lessening inequalities, is multiple better versions of Heimatkunde, or whatever you want to call it. A geo-humanistic education that connects subnational love to planetary care. Maybe there could be a German compound word for such a concept. I must say, I rather like the quaint word Naturdenkmäler. By comparison, the global English phrase protected area management lacks resonance. It completely misses the emotional and philosophical and spiritual reasons why people might care to protect land in the first place. I'll leave you with a contemporary German example, with the caveat that my knowledge of German politics is rudimentary. Even so, last fall, I could not avoid two news stories, Chemnitz and Hambacher. In my mind, at least, these two local events from Eastern and Western Germany were somehow related and stood for twin calamities that affect my country too. The success of far-right ethno-nationalists in globalizing their politics, and the failure of international politicians in decarbonizing the global economy. As a historian of ancient trees, I have mixed feelings about Hamacher Forest, a small wooded area adjacent to Germany's largest brown coal strip mine. This is not an Urwald. On some level, that is fake news. Or in less inflammatory terms, I'd say, you should take the claims of climate activists that Hamacher is as old as the Holocene just as seriously as the estimate of the immortal Alexander von Humboldt that the dragon tree of Tenerife dated to the last revolution of the earth. For Humboldtians, the exactness of any one measurement was less important than the total practice and comparative applications of measuring and discovering. I want to suggest that the spirit of Humboldt lives on at Schlossplatz and also in Hamacher Forest, where citizen naturalists have discovered something rare, remarkable, even cosmic, in a small-scale wooded area. Here they have made the measure of a nation in relation to memorial trees and much older monuments of nature, the layers of lignite beneath their roots, as yet unviolated. For these reasons, in my mind, Hamacher Forest is both an old and a new kind of Naturdenkmal whose protection and care is anything but Wurzelkram. Thanks for your time.
Jared, for a truly fascinating and Sorry, I have a really bad throat, an educative talk. I wanted to push you a little, especially because towards the end you had this beautiful and provocative call to say that, that all protection of the environment is local, but also will in the local constitute and complement these transnational global efforts. And so it was interesting that you began with this history of protected areas by saying that the two kind of precursors are sacred groves and royal forests. And to me, these, of course, as you know, are constitutive of certain kinds of authority, religious authority and imperial state authority that protected land. And so in your last call, you went from saying, deliberately, I thought, because you're so careful and articulate with the words that you use, from saying subnational to transnational. But the point is, these are national monuments. And so you have this reference to, what does it mean? And maybe I'm reading into this, but some idea of patriotism or nationalism. But is there a way in which I might take your talk as someone who studies nationalism to say that what we need is perhaps national monuments, taken as national monuments, trees, to constitute a new kind of nationalism that is inclusive, and so that aim that you said of democracies that are committed to reducing inequality, which to me happens through a solidaristic nationalism, is there a way in which that can actually happen through constructing national monuments that are trees rather than blood and soil? Or do you think of the two as in conflict? Or to me, national monuments are national, and yet you went from the subnational to the transnational. And so I was wondering if I could push you.
Natural monuments are usually national, but they don't necessarily have to be national. Of course, in German history, I think they originally were definitely subnational or proto-nationalistic. And in America, there's not a true equivalent to listed trees, except at the city level. There are heritage tree ordinances that are done at the city level, and that's a very local, it's like subnational. I guess trees, one reason they're so interesting to think about is that they can simultaneously be local, subnational, national, and international. And, one tree in its lifetime can go from being a fascist tree to an anti-fascist tree, or it can be both at the same time. You know what I mean? But people have attempted. I want to say one thing I did not talk about tonight is World Heritage, right, which is another one of these programs coming out of the post-World War II era. There is a category of World Heritage, natural heritage, and in some cases, natural monuments, which can be national monuments too, have been listed as World Heritage. I think World Heritage, as originally conceived by Julian Huxley et al., was meant to be this new, along with the UN, this new kind of international way of thinking that transcended. But if you look at the long history of the World Heritage Program, it's been entirely captured by national interests. But that doesn't mean that there are examples where there is, let's say, a single tree that has multiple communities who love it. If you think of Hamacher, there are lots of activists from all over Europe who come here, but then I think the German ones have a very specific way of relating to this in relation to German state policy. So
I guess a succinct way to kind of pose my question is, can trees help us rescue nationalism? Can you help us rescue nationalism? Because we fight over whether a Confederate soldier or, monuments, statues become the site for the spilling of blood and what constitutes nationalism today. Right. And so is there a way in which, Lebanon, as you answered my question, I sent Jared a photograph of a flag in a Lebanese restaurant in Pennsylvania and said, is the Lebanese national flag the only one with a tree on it? And Jared sent me a typically Jared response telling me that there were many flags which had oaks and seeds and acorns, but Lebanon was the only flag with a tree on it. And so to me, is there a way in which...
well, it's the only conifer. There are some palm trees. Right. It's the most arborescent of all the flags, certainly.
But I guess I'm saying, is there a way in which we can consume... Again, in your answer, I see you shying away from this idea of trees as national monuments.
Well, maybe this is my own sentimentalism that, I want to believe that trees can help. There's that bumper sticker, right? Trees are the answer. Of course, it depends what the question is. I don't think the trees are the answer to everything, but I think they can help. And I think they can help because they encourage us to think in longer units of time. And there are lots of trees all over the world, in almost every country, that are much older than that country's constitution. The oldest constitution in the world is not very old, really. And every country has trees older than that. And So again, I mean, and there are selected trees that can get us individually back to 5,000 years. And so I think there's this encouragement to long-term thinking, which by itself is not automatically good, because of course National Socialists were really good at long-term thinking. I mean, bad at carrying it out, thank God, right? But like, Tausendjähriger Reich, Tausendjähriger Eich. I mean, there's a weird kind of, I know that's a, you know what I mean? But it's not the tree's fault, and like that Goethe, Eiche, and Buchenwald, right? Like you could think of it as like a symbol of Nazism, but I think for a lot of people in the camp, actually, it was a symbol of what was good about German culture, or it was just a symbol of like this other thing away from culture, from the earth itself, that is sustaining and beautiful. So I mean, yeah, I think trees help, but then of course you need good ideas to go with the trees. I mean, because like I wrote a whole article recently about trees in the United States that have been sites of incredible violence. I mean, famously lynching trees, but there are other forms of extreme kind of racial violence performed at trees. And again, it's not the tree's fault. And I think, you know what I mean? Like, I mean, you can very simply say the trees are the answer, or that, you know, just because Nazis love trees and like something's wrong with like the German relationship with trees. Like, I don't think so. I think having lived in Germany this past year, even though I know this is largely a 19th century invention, I think actually like inventions actually have long-term effects. And I want to see Germans actually do have a special relationship with the forest now, compared to like the French or the Poles or the Italians. Like, you know, all these like kindergartens in the, you know, Tito's in the woods, or all these, you know, just the way the Germans walk in the forest and ramble and wander, and you know what I mean? Like, I mean, other people do that too, but I want to say like Germans, they internalize this, and maybe you could say, just because Nazis internalize it doesn't mean that everything that came before it. Anyway, so I want to say that yes, trees help, but by themselves, you know, a tree is, you have to meet it with good ideas. But I think if you meet it with good ideas, trees are the great givers on planet Earth. You know, they make soil, they make air. They created the biosphere that we all live in. Without trees, there never would be the planet Earth that animals inhabit on land. Because there once was an Earth, right, where the animals were in the sea and the plants were on land, but then trees helped create, you know, the planet that we call home. There have been lots of planet Earths, and most of them were not nice in terms of, like, they would not sustain our life anyway. That's a long-winded answer, but.
So I have a quick question. First, a note of appreciation of the way you were attentive to language in every way.
Yes, I was inspired by you in part, Emily. I wanted to meet your, like, high critical standard, yeah.
So there were terms that seemed to me were carefully avoided. One being ecology and eco-politics, and the other, which was bandied around by some young curators that I was speaking with about a year ago. And it actually relates to Prerna's question. Just 1 second, but it was the term zomia, which is the study of planetary cartographies through forest areas and through certain kinds of ecological regionalism as political categories, as well as aesthetic categories, as well as ecological ones. And I mention this vocabulary because it does seem to lend support to this idea that of resistance to the national approach, which you've made it in some ways a quite compelling case for it, but I'm one of those cosmopolitans that could never go towards that kind of earth and soil and Heimat stuff in a million years, and I'm thinking, why wouldn't you go more towards the vocabulary of an earth politics, a commons, a zomia politics, and eco-politics? What's wrong with that?
I mean, I think, you know, every people, every nation, every language group probably has to, like, come up with its own. I mean, activists, I think, in every setting have to find the vocabulary that works for them. You know, and it's not my place to, like, really say if Germans should try to recuperate Heimat, which is, like, you know, it's a very interesting word. But I understand all the, or I'm not a German historian, but like I begin to understand all the ways this is a very complicated thing. But I want to say that like Hugo Convents, I've read a lot about him, even though there's something really annoying about his approach, and then also like really objectionable if you think about some of his policies vis-a-vis occupied Poland. I think he was onto something when he said that essentially like natural monuments don't need state protection if a society is functioning the way that is healthy. That's why should the state be like protecting an individual tree? It's like people should just protect, you know, their local tree that they love. That should be internalized on some level. I mean, you know, this is a very German approach, like, you know, this massive database, and then you turn it over to like local clubs. And again, like the way this you know played out in the 20s and 30s, and how some of these figures like persisted into the mid 20th century without really critically examining like how Cometz's ideas were, you know, taken up by National Socialists. It is disturbing, but like I want to say there's something like essentially valuable in that notion that there are different scales of action, right? When it comes to like, I don't know, like carbon taxes perhaps, or cap and trade, or, you know, international treaties involving greenhouse gases. Like, you do need states, you need signatories, you need big conventions, but there are lots of other scales down to like the local, and at some point, like, nothing is protected unless local people care about their local environments and feel like enfranchised, and, you know, and feel, you know, wellness, and you know, that have the kind of lives where they have security, but also they care about their local place and see how that is connected on various scales, all the way up to the planetary. And, you know, I don't have the answers to this, but I guess maybe in part because I come from a deeply local place, even though I've left it and I will never go back. Where am I from? I'm from Utah. That I can't give up on. I mean, I didn't grow up with the word Heimat, but I did grow up with the word homeland, which means something very, very different in the world I grew up in. And I don't think I would actually use it anymore, but there are lots of people, I think, in the world who have that homey connection. And yeah, I mean, if you're the kind of person who can, I guess, mentally, conceptually, like make the leap from that kind of home, whatever you want to call it, that kind of home level to the planetary, that's great. But I think, you know, that kind of scalar conceptual work, you know, is, I don't know, Perna, do you want to jump in?
Well, we know cosmopolitanism doesn't work. And when I say by work is we have this research that shows that people are more likely to do stuff when you can connect it either to like small communities or to a political site that is the site of affective resonance. So the challenge for cosmopolitans has always been that there isn't the institutional structure to kind of back that level of identification, which is why it kind of, you know, that's why Theresa May can say something like, if you're citizens of the world, where's your home? And use that to discredit the British left in the wake of the debates over Brexit. So I'll shut up, but, you know.
No, it's just it was very striking, like living in New York and how going to like the People's Climate March, which is like in Manhattan. But then there are lots of people who think themselves as the people in America for whom like that's not their people and that's not their world, but they actually care about their world, right? And they care about the earth, and it's like, I guess, finding vocabularies, words, concepts. I know this is like maybe like really naive and like 2 years into the Trump administration, but like finding concepts that can, you know, bridge some of these things. Maybe it has to wait until we have a different kind of leadership in my country, but I'm not ready to give up yet that there's a possibility, because there are lots of people, at least in the world I grew up in, who are very, very conservative, but then have a kind of spiritual love for their local landscape, and like they don't want to trash it. They don't want to like lose winter entirely. They don't, you know what I mean?
Thank you, Jared.
Hi, David.
Beautiful, beautifully crafted talk, especially with the long-range historical dimension. I just want to flip the dimension of time around and think about the distant future rather than just the
Sure.
past that you had here. When I was listening to your talk, I was thinking all the way through of Peter Gallison's remarkable recent documentary about how to remind the future about the positions of nuclear waste dumps.
Yes.
The kinds of projection into the future where we remind future communities 2,000, 5,000, 10,000, 100,000 years hence for something deeply dangerous and destructive under the mountain, in the earth, ticking away. And he and various artists and others have tried to imagine the ways in which we could tell the future about the danger that might lie beneath a mountain, inside a mountain that has a nuclear dump inside it. Coming back precisely to Brenda's question, how do we create that kind of affective attachment, not just here and now in the present, but project it hundreds or even thousands of years into the future to continue this kind of consciousness of monumentality, the need to protect, the need to conserve? Do you have a program for the future that emerges from your understanding of the past that can help us look forward?
Do not have a program for the future. But again, I want to say, I guess the reason I'm writing this book is I think trees can help. You know, because like people talk about, you know, the next generation or like my children's children or the seventh generation, all these platitudes that politicians repeat, but then nobody really, especially, you know, like that's just not built into capitalism, right? That's absolutely not. Because the future generations, they're not alive, and people don't really care about them that much, and we'll all be dead. Trump and his generation, they'll all be dead when the really challenging times arrive. But are there like things around today, beings, things that we give honorary personhood to that are already alive, that will be alive in that future? Well, yes, there are. There are trees. I mean, I'm going to say trees are one of the few like non-animal things that we honor as beings. Not all trees, but there are certain trees, right? The ones we consider remarkable for whatever reason. It's usually deeply cultural, but I kind of like that. There are pre-venerable trees, right? There are young trees alive today that will be old trees in a very changed climate that will manage to survive. And they're already around. And so I want to say that, you know, caring for those trees or the idea of those trees as a kind of gift to future people who will live with those trees too in a changed climate. Like that's just one, I guess, like mental practice as well as like an actual practice. I mean, sometimes I've thought of a program, I don't know if this would work, like if cities, this would be like harnessing like sense of competition or maybe like between cities. Like if cities thought ahead to like what the climate will probably be, let's say 100 years from now, just kind of like maybe like the horizon of what we can imagine or predict. And plant a tree that is likely to thrive in that future climate and plant it in some symbolic location inside the city and then try to keep it alive. It wouldn't have to be a competition, but like that is one way of thinking. And of course, some of these trees will die, and that's fine. It's more about like, again, the idea and the practice of planning ahead. I mean, 100-year planning is like the gold standard, and but it's rarely, you know, as talking to Tony, you see, you know, most buildings are insured like 20 years, and that's the life horizon of a building, like 20 years. Yeah, again, a changed climate will sort of not doom, but like there are many old trees that whose lives will be cut short of their potential by climate change, but there'll still be old trees, and there'll be a new kind of old trees or old trees in new locations, and sort of thinking like that. I mean, there's an alternative. There was a proposal that won an award for a kind of memorial to climate change that was supposed to go up in DC, but it's not going to happen now. Maybe it never will. The idea was we'll plant a new area of Japanese cherry trees, but we'll do it in a way that as the Potomac rises, they will drown, and we'll leave them as dead skeletons. and that's a kind of memorial. Germans are really good at that kind of memorial, right? It's amazing memorials in this country. But there's a different kind of memorial too, which is like, let's try to keep something alive. And of course, trees will die. I mean, unlike, like a Notre Dame, like no one's really going to let it decay. I mean, you could argue at some level, that all monuments should eventually be ruined. But in fact, we have a hard time letting go of buildings. Whereas like trees, ultimately, trees die eventually. All trees die, but then you can plant a new tree in a way that you can't just like plant a new Notre Dame. You know what I mean? So I want to say it's a kind of like, again, effective practice, like mental practice, but actual like a real kind of act of care that to me is meaningful. I mean, by itself, again, trees are not the answer to everything, but I never expected to become the tree guy, but I guess I have become the tree guy. So. Okay. Werner, you have...
Yeah, thank you for your wonderful talk. There's a nice German saying, man sieht den Wald vor lauter Bäumen nicht. So you cannot see the forest because there are so many trees.
Yeah, you say that in German too? Yeah.
It's a proverb.
Yes.
Yes. And what about the relation between the tree and the forest? So in Germany, everybody reads now Peter Wohlleben.
Right.
Sure.
The secret, hidden life, secret life of trees. Yeah.
Yes, something like that.
Yeah.
Yes. And so it's very much that trees do not exist in themselves, but they are always connected to other trees and the term of the web of life and everything.
Right.
So this is contrary to the focus on the monumental individual tree. So what
And I would
do you
say,
about the relation between tree and forest?
And again, I would say both are great. I mean, yes, the idea that like a tree is an individual, that by itself is like a biological fiction. Trees are modular organisms, right? Each branch, each twig of a tree is in essence like its own life form, right? You can cut off like a part of a tree and plant it in the ground, and it grows into another tree. Like that's just fundamentally different than animals. And so when human animals imagine a tree as an individual, that by itself is already like a cultural invention. But then, of course, there's like the underworld, which is like this amazingly still unknown part of ecology, right? So like a lot of you learned about the relationships between fungi and trees, which is like even more mind-blowing and amazing than we ever thought. But then trees actually like connect to each other, even different species, and pass information, pass nutrients. It's just this incredible like community. And you can draw all these like cool metaphors about how society should work by looking at, and I think that's great. And also, even though I can like culturally deconstruct the idea of an individual tree, I also think that it's not bad that people venerate 1,000-year trees, even if they're not really 1,000 years old. You know what I mean? As long as, again, like there are lots of trees that have been co-opted for what I would consider ugly ideologies, but then there's just as many examples of people using them for things I would consider good. So I don't actually see, I see these as complementary. I mean, inevitably, like when we have relationships to a life form that's so different from us, we're going to bring our own ideas to it. So I think the full life of trees, a community of trees, which is not just trees, but it's also like this incredibly rich microbial community and like interspecies tree communication and sharing, that is really great to think about. Metaphorically, that's so rich. I mean, scientifically, that's just fascinating as an alternative way. I mean, just for example, like there's the great French botanist, I can blank on his name, Francis Halley, I think, who had this like thought experiment, like what if basically it was like there's no more food for animals. Okay, here's the thought. Okay, all the plants are gone. That was it. Poof, magic. All the trees are gone. All the plants are gone. It's just animals on planet Earth. Like, what would happen? Just imagine like the worst kind of gladiatorial, like bloodbath, like horror movie, like the worst possible thing you can imagine. Within like hours, right? Every animal would just be like killing every other animal, and then just be like the one last animal standing, right, with blood everywhere, and it would stink, right? It just would be like the smell of protein and blood and decay and rot. Just be like, it would be like, Okay, but imagine a different scenario. All the animals in the world, poof, vanish. how would the plants respond? Well, for some who need pollinators, like certain bats, or there's certain trees that need insects more than others, like, they might go extinct or locally extinct, but in the long run, they would do just fine because they lived on Earth for like millions and millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions years with no animals. And it would smell great. You know what I mean? And they would still cooperate. And, so again, like thinking about like plant communities, I think is like really rich metaphorically. But also I think it's also humbling to kind of think that, yeah, we animals, or we human animals, or the last hominid standing, because, the recent evidence is that there were all kinds of hominids, and we probably killed them all out, right? We were the last one standing, in a sense. So it's just humbling. It puts things in perspective that, I hope Homo sapiens sapiens has a nice long run here on planet Earth, but at some point, our luck will run out too, and we hope. I guess we hope that the next species who inherits this role of caregivers does a better job. But until then, I think we need to do the best we can. Keep it going. Okay, that's my philosophical answer, Brian.
Thank you very much for your talk. I would like to say something. I believe that longevity, or the idea of longevity and size, really seem to matter in our relationship towards trees. And there's a man in Germany, in the area of Kassel, in central Germany, who years ago had the idea to give somebody a sapling from a giant tree as a birthday present. And out of this idea developed a business called Junge Riesen. So he's basically started cultivating young giants.
Yeah.
And within a very short time, he told me that every politician in the area now wants to be portrayed when one of the young giants finds a new owner. And seems to be a great demand, or there is a great demand for purchasing these.
Oh yeah. And there's a project in America called, I think, the Archangel Project. There's a whole book called The Man Who Planted Trees. There's it's like a private foundation that essentially clones monumental trees. I mean, the science of it is a little iffy, but again, it gets people excited about trees and about life, and I don't actually have a big problem with it, even though, I mean, there is a correlation between size and longevity. To achieve really big size, you have to live a certain number of years, but the oldest trees in the world are actually generally small. So it's a loose correlation.
Excuse me for interrupting, but in this case, the interesting thing is the people who buy these trees do not know if they will become giants.
They do not know.
Landmarks.
Right.
And so it is maybe a kind of trust.
Right. Yeah, I mean, one of the striking things I've learned in my research is that the trees that have made it past 1,000 years, and there's only, I added up the number once. It's between 20 and 30 species have that kind of capacity to live more than 1,000 years. But most of the individuals that we know of that have exceeded that, it's a combination of like genetic potential. You need a certain environmental conditions. Some sites are just better than others. But in many cases, there's this third element of human care.
But in talking to him, I also learned, or he said, or claimed, that 1,000-year-old oaks really don't exist, that they're mostly 400.
No one has ever found, I mean, no dendrochronologist, tree scientist has ever dated, oaks don't live that long. They live up to 800 years. 500 years is really old. And again, like, different trees have different capacities. So a 500-year-old oak is really impressive. And that's like, that's amazing. Not everything's cut out to be 1,000 years. I mean, in general, gymnosperms live longer than angiosperms, and in the cypress family live longer than almost anything else. So in continental Europe, yews, ibin, have the greatest longevity potential. We need certain sites. But again, human care is a key component. And in parts of the world where people have been living intensively for a long time, the oldest trees are generally in shrines. They're in churchyards. they are somehow marked. People know that they're old. They don't know exactly how old, but then people have been caring for them in various ways for generation after generation after generation, which I find very moving. Yeah.
Are there tree networks? Are there networks of people who are caring for trees? Because I think, labor is the engaging factor when people have to work at the tree.
Right.
In some way, work with the tree. And I wonder then about, there are these citizen science networks for watching a planetary activity or celestial activity. And I wonder if that might not be a way of connecting the local, that if you have local and international networks of people who are caring for trees, and
Right.
both bring something towards saving nationalism, but also saving in a way that doesn't carry the seeds.
Yeah, I don't know of any, like, oh. Yeah, we'll get to that. She was just asking, are there groups? I can't think of any, like, international group devoted to tree care. I mean, there are, like, these, if you go to the web, like, there's monumentaltrees.org or something that has people represented from all over the world who contribute. It's very Convencian in that sense people are contributing data. And then different nations, like in Britain especially, there's like the Ancient Tree Forum, and there's some other associations that Prince Charles is quite invested in this. And then in America, there's American Forest, which is an organization. But yeah, there might even be more potential. So Jenny, did you have a?
I did have a question, but I have a couple of responses to things that people have said.
Great.
I just want to draw your attention to two tree monument projects, and I thought the gentleman who in the third row who was mentioning the Castle project was going to point to this, but didn't. In 1982, the artist Joseph Beuys created a project called 7,000 Oaks, in which in the town of Kassel, for the art installation documenta, and wanted basically to create a decentralized tree monument in the city as a kind of acknowledgement of the violence that urban development can, the havoc that it can wreak on the city. And so he planted a series of saplings, 7,000 saplings around the city of Kassel, and next to them stone, such that when, I was just reminded of this by some of the other comments, when each tree dies, it's then replaced by this sort of grassroots organization, making this project an interesting experiment in this kind of environmentalist longevity that you're talking about. And the other monument is a sort of similarly decentralized project. I was reminded of this by the Buchenwald picture. Not from that camp, but instead from Theresienstadt. There was a tree that was brought in by a camp guard to give to a group of children in honor of the Jewish New Year of the trees. A group of children cared for it. Many of them didn't make it out of the camp. But then over the course of the post-war period, the tree became a sort of monument in itself, and people started coming and taking cuttings from it, planting them in different places, and as those plantings have grown, people have collected seeds from them to continue planting in other parts of the world as a kind of, again, decentralized monument to the Holocaust with some kind of longevity. So it strikes me that that there is an effort, and this is kind of a response to Prana's question. I think people are using the beauty of a tree as opposed to a stone monument is that it has a life and can be propagated and sort of functions as a different.
And that reminds me of a Los Angeles-based artist, and I'm blanking on the name, but I think I'll give you enough information you can find it. So, in the 1936 Olympics, I think it was just the gold medal winners, maybe all the medal winners were given little oak saplings. And later they became known as like the Hitler icon. But they went back with the gold medalists all over the world, and people planted them because they were, they got the medal, but they got the oaks. And so this artist tried to track down some of the winners, especially like African American winners, and like found these beautiful trees that people have been caring for now a couple generations in places, like Los Angeles. And again, finding like great worth and beauty in these things that like many people say like, oh, you know, isn't that creepy, or, you know, Hitler-Ica. But then, you know, when you see these photographs of, you know, African Americans, Latinos in Los Angeles who love this tree, it's in their backyard, it's like, it's a very different, and I think that points to, so thank you so much. I didn't know about either of those memorial trees, and I will look into it. One more question, maybe?
I always think of the tree of life, and being well rooted is life as well for trees, plants, and humans. And that is this sense of belonging. And that is the same idea like Heimat. And if you have politicians who are nationalists, then they stress the value of a nation, but there are many different places of upbringing, and therefore comes the interest in Heimat and, and stuff. And dictators need for advertising themselves people who let them mislead them, and therefore they advertise the idea that they bring them to the roots.
Right.
And,
yeah, you see this.
That is
Yeah.
an abuse just of what is meaning for people, Heimat and sense of belonging.
Sure. I mean, you see this in the United States too. I mean, you know, like one of like the oldest ways of denigrating immigrants is to use, you know, the metaphor of rootedness versus, you know, rootlessness or uprootedness. And this can be, of course, very anti-Semitic, but it can just be a general kind of like xenophobic metaphor. I mean, trees are just this essential metaphorical stuff. It's one of like the earliest, you know, natural objects, I think, that people use to express ideas, you know, to go to a tree. And so, I mean, you can express any idea, any beautiful, any ugly, you know, any democratic, any totalitarian idea with a tree if you want to. It's just, you can do it. And there are these, you know, charts that shows eugenics is a tree, and, you know, but you could also use it to describe anything else. I would say that, okay, if you want to think of an alternative metaphor with the tree, yes, trees are the ultimate locals. They're the ultimate terrestrials. They're rooted in earth. You know, they reach up to the sky. They're solar powered, right? It's amazing. On the other hand, like, they're the ultimate like planetary beings. They have the ultimate global citizenship because like they're helping to create the air we breathe, they create the atmosphere. And in fact, they're not totally stationary. Like, trees move. They just move so slow you don't notice, right? But if you look at time-lapse photography, like, trees are amazing. They dance, right? They dance in really slow motion. But also, like, they send seeds off, and they can sometimes send roots down, and then a new tree grows. But also, people take cuttings and they take them places. Dragon trees grow all over the world, right? Trees are incredibly mobile. So there's a way I think you can say trees are both, right? Trees are the ultimate locals. And again, I want to say it's up to us, I'll just use that word, to talk about all the positive variances of rootedness with trees, but also think about how trees can also be like symbols of, you know, the planetary and the terrestrial. I think they can be both. And that, I think, is the end.